The morning Lord Ashmore died. The candles in the great hall at Dunvale had not yet been lit. Cecily Hartwell stood at the edge of the unlit room, her plain gray gown, the color of the November sky beyond the tall windows, and she listened to Mr. Prentice, the family solicitor, read the date on a document she had never seen before. She listened to him read the name of the sole beneficiary. She watched the man seated across the long table, Mr. Roland Vane, the late lord's nephew by his elder sister's marriage, spread both hands flat against the mahogany, as though steadying himself against a lurch. He was not, she understood, steadying himself at all. He was pressing down the way a man presses a coin into wet wax. She had been Lord Ashmore's secretary for 3 years. She had read every letter he wrote, copied every instruction, organized every document in the study that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. She knew what his handwriting looked like under candlelight and under morning sun. The slight rightward lean, the looping capital A, the way the old man invariably ran his final signature, up into a flourish no other hand could reproduce. She had seen him sign his true will in March. She had witnessed it herself, her name on the attestation page in her own neat hand, alongside that of Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper. The document Mr. Prentice now held was dated October. The attestation bore 2 names she did not recognize. Cecily said nothing. She folded her hands inside her gloves, the left thumb pressing against the right forefinger until she felt the bone of it, and she looked at Roland Vane, and she understood then that he knew she knew. If she had spoken then, in that cold room, with only the solicitor and the steward and his own particular friend from London, arranged in a semicircle around that table, she would have been dismissed before the sentence was finished. She was a woman in service. She had no legal standing. She had no family name that would carry weight in a county whose respect ran along the lines of an inheritance. She was, as the nephew had already told Mr. Matter. Prentice in the corridor that morning, only the secretary. And she had heard him say it through the library door, which she had opened herself 3 minutes later, quietly, with her face in its usual composition, as though she had not heard a word. The world was not yet done deciding what Cecily Hartwell was. But she had 3 years of Lord Ashmore's correspondence in her memory, a copied inventory of every document in the estate's files, and a copy of the March will, in a locked case in her own small room above the servants' stair. She had not known, in March, why she had thought to make a copy. She had told herself it was diligence. It was habit. It was the particular care one takes when one has learned that the world does not keep safe the things belonging to people it has decided to overlook. She kept her hands folded. She looked out the window at the bare oaks along the drive. And she waited. If you have come this far with Cecily, stay close. What happens at Dunvale will ask for your patience, and reward it. He moved into Dunvale by the end of the week. He brought his friend, a Mr. Sherbury. Sefton, whose function at the estate appeared to be ornamental, and a man of business from London called Crabbe, who began conducting interviews with the household staff before the late lord was 3 days in the churchyard. Cecily was not asked to assist. She was told with considerable courtesy that her services would no longer be required once the transition was complete, and that she would of course receive a character reference from Mr. Prentice appropriate to her years of faithful work. She thanked Mr. Prentice with equal courtesy and asked how long she might remain. 3 weeks, he said. Perhaps 4. Cecily nodded. She went upstairs, and she unlocked the case, and she sat for an hour reading Lord Ashmore's March will in full, from the dated heading to the final clause. She could recite it by memory already. She read it again anyway, because the physical sensation of the paper in her hands was steadying in a way that memory alone was not. Lord Ashmore had left Dunvale, his London house, and the income of the Devonshire property, to Miss Harriet Pembroke, his great-niece, a girl of 9 who lived with her widowed mother in Bath, and who had visited Dunvale twice in the 3 years of Cecily's tenure, both times bringing a small stuffed rabbit and a solemn expression, and a habit of appearing at Cecily's desk to ask what the letters were about. He had left nothing to the nephew. The 2 men had quarreled in the spring of the previous year over a matter Cecily had not been privy to, but the quarrel had been conclusive. Lord Ashmore had said in Cecily's hearing, and without apparent awareness, that she could hear him through the study wall, that Roland was his sister's boy, and he had done his duty by him, and he would not be pressed further. The nephew had been pressed further by no one. He had simply, it appeared, waited. The morning after Cecily read the March will for the 17th time, she put on her second-best gown, which was a dark green that approached respectability without achieving it, and she asked Mrs. Peel if she might borrow the housekeeper's carriage into the village. Mrs. Peel, who had been at Dunvale for 19 years, and whose eyes had been red for a week, said yes, without asking why. Cecily went to find Lord Dunmore. His name was Gideon Ashmore. He was Lord Ashmore's youngest brother's son, which made him the late lord's nephew by a different branch, and made him, if the March will held, the executor named, to oversee the estate until Harriet Pembroke came of age. He was 34, recently returned from the continent, and he had arrived at Dunvale for the reading of the will only to find himself replaced at the executor's chair by a document he had not seen and a solicitor who appeared to believe the matter settled. He was staying at the King's Arms, which was the only inn the village possessed, and which was very small and smelled of pipe smoke and horse. He answered Cecily's knock at the parlor door himself, which told her the inn staff was limited, and he looked at her for a long moment before he stepped aside to let her in. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes the color of pewter in the dim light of the parlor. He wore no cravat. He had the look of a man who had been sitting with a problem for several days and had not slept well in the sitting. He did not apologize for the cravat. Cecily did not remark on it. "You are Miss Hartwell," he said. "I have been told you are only the secretary." "I was told the same thing," Cecily said. "I thought you might be interested in what a secretary sees." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." He did not soften it into an invitation. It was a command. She sat, and she put the copy of the March will on the table between them, and she watched his face as he read it, and she thought that he was the kind of man who went very still when something mattered. He went very still. He read it twice. He set it down with care. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I copied it in March," Cecily said. "I witnessed the signing. My name is on the attestation page of the original, which is filed under the east drawer of the study cabinet, inside a folio Lord Ashmore labeled Household Accounts for 1818. Deliberately misfiled," Gideon Ashmore said. "I believe so," Cecily said, "by someone who did not know I had made a copy." He looked at her then, not at the document. It was the look of a man recalculating the dimensions of a room he thought he had measured. She held it steadily and did not permit her hands to show that her pulse was doing something irregular. "You could have taken this to Prentice yourself," he said. "Mr. Prentice," Cecily said carefully, "appears to have received the October document in good faith. He may also have interests I cannot fully account for. I required someone with standing, and you came to me," he said. "You are the named executor," Cecily said. "You have standing. I have a copy and a memory, and 3 weeks before I am turned out." He rose and moved to the window. The village street beyond it was quiet in the gray morning. A farrier's hammer, striking somewhere distant, a cart moving past the low stone wall. He stood with his hands behind his back, and she could see the tension in the line of his shoulders, the controlled quality of a man who knows what his face will show if he turns too soon. "There are 2 signatures on the attestation of the October document," he said, without turning. Prentice named them. "Sefton and Crabbe." "Yes," Cecily said, "both of whom arrived at Dunvale in Roland's company." "Yes," Cecily said. "Witnesses to a will," he said, "cannot be beneficiaries of that will, nor connected to the beneficiary by interest. If Sefton is Roland's man, the attestation is void on its face." He turned then. His jaw had the quality of something carved, the muscles along it tight. "If we can establish the connection and then produce the March document with its proper witnesses, the October will collapses." "Mrs. Peel witnessed the March will alongside me," Cecily said. She is still in the house. She will be pressured, he said. She loved Lord Ashmore, Cecily said. She has 19 years of service at Dunvale, and she has been crying since the morning he died. She will not be pressured easily. He looked at her again. That same quality of attention, as though he was adding and arriving at a sum he had not expected. She was accustomed to being looked through. She was not entirely accustomed to being looked at, and she kept her breathing level with an effort she did not allow her face to show. "You have been very thorough," he said. "I was Lord Ashmore's secretary," Cecily said. Thoroughness was the position. He made a sound that was not quite agreement, and not quite something else, and he moved to pour water into 2 cups from the pitcher on the side table. He brought one to her without ceremony, the way one brings water to someone who is going to be at the table for a while. She took it. She drank. She did not remark on the fact that no one had offered her water in the 3 weeks since Lord Ashmore died. Not once. What followed was 3 days of careful, quiet work. He rode to the county seat to consult a second solicitor, a man named Hartley, whom he trusted from prior dealings, and he took the copy of the March will with him and returned with Hartley at his side. Cecily, in those 3 days, went about her final duties at Dunvale as though nothing had changed, cataloguing the remaining household correspondence, sorting Lord Ashmore's papers for eventual transfer. He watched her from doorways. He watched her the way a man watches a weather vane, trying to determine which direction the wind is building. She gave him nothing to read. She was courteous. She was efficient. She was, in every visible particular, only the secretary. On the 3rd evening, he came to her in the corridor outside the study. He was alone. Mr. Sefton was at the card table in the parlor. Mr. Crabbe had gone to the village. The house was quiet in the way. Large houses are quiet at 8 in the evening, when the servants have retired below stairs, and the fires are banked for the night. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was pleasant. He was a pleasant-looking man, brown-haired and regular-featured, with good boots and a silver pin in his cravat. He looked like someone a hostess would seat next to a widow at dinner. "I think perhaps we ought to speak plainly." "I would welcome plain speech," Cecily said. "You have been at Dunvale 3 years," he said. "You have served faithfully. It would be a great pity if a character reference were to fall into difficulty." She understood him. A character reference from a man contesting a will was no character reference at all. He was telling her she was in his hands. She said, "I quite agree that the matter of references is a serious one. I hope, Mr. Carr, Prentice will remember that I was a careful and accurate keeper of Lord Ashmore's correspondence." His pleasant expression did not change. His eyes, however, did something that was not pleasant at all. "Lord Ashmore," he said, "sometimes lost track of his papers, especially toward the end. I imagine he may have signed things he did not fully attend to." Cecily looked at him. She thought of Lord Ashmore reading her the clause. "About Harriet in March," his voice quiet with the particular dignity of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to leave behind. She thought of the looping capital A in his signature. She thought of the way he had pressed the seal himself with both hands, and said, "There. That is done, then?" "I believe," Cecily said, "that Lord Ashmore was in full command of his faculties in March of this year, which is the relevant question." The pleasant expression fell away entirely. He was shorter than she had always thought. Or perhaps he seemed so now. He moved to the right, fractionally, as men do when they are deciding whether to block a doorway. He did not block it. The executor's voice came from the end of the corridor, calm and even, as though he had simply finished an unrelated piece of business and happened to be passing. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Hartley has the documents ready. He is waiting in the library." The nephew turned. He looked at the man in the doorway, and he looked at Cecily, and something passed across his face that was not quite calculation and not quite recognition, but that lived between the two. He said nothing. He was a man who had built something elaborate, and who had just understood that a foundation beam was missing. He stepped aside. Solicitor Hartley had, in those 3 days, discovered several material facts. That Sefton was his first cousin by marriage, a connection that disqualified him entirely as a valid witness to a will from which the nephew stood to benefit. That the 2 witnesses named on the October document could not have been present at Dunvale on the date written, because both men had been in London at a particular subscription dinner, whose attendance record was a matter of the club's own files, and that the paper on which the October will was written, examined under strong light against a sample of Dunvale's own estate stationery, bore the watermark of a London paper house that had not supplied Lord Ashmore's estate since 1815. It was not 1 defect, it was 4. Hartley laid them before Mr. C. Prentice the following morning in the library, with Lord Dunmore seated to his left, and Cecily standing to one side with her hands folded, because no one had offered her a chair, and she had not asked for one. The nephew was not present. He had, the underfootman reported, called for his horse at first light. Mr. Prentice read the evidence. He read it again. He was a small man with a gray face, and he went somewhat grayer. "The March document," he said at last. "Is the valid will," Hartley said pleasantly. "The October document is a forgery on its face, which I have no doubt a proper court of chancery will confirm. I trust, Prentice, that you received it in good faith, and that your participation does not require further inquiry." There was a silence, in which several things became apparent to Mr. Prentice. He said with considerable precision that he had received the October document in good faith. He said that he would naturally cooperate fully with any proceeding to restore the March will to its proper effect. He said all of this in the tone of a man who has just discovered dry ground beneath him and intends to stand on it for a very long time. She would inherit Dunvale. The Devonshire income would be preserved for her majority. The executor named in the March will would oversee the estate until she came of age, and she who had kept a copy of a document because she was thorough would be required for nothing further. She remained in the room after Hartley and Prentice had gone out to arrange. What needed arranging the fire was low. The library smelled of the particular dust of undisturbed books, which she had always found comforting, and the morning light came through the east window in the flat, clean way it does when the sky has been rinsed of cloud. He did not go out immediately, but stood by the hearth, his arm along the mantel, and looked at the fire for a while. "You did not sit down this morning," he said. "No one offered me a chair," Cecily said. He turned and looked at her with the expression she had come over the course of 4 days to recognize as the face he made when he was going to say something that cost him something. "I should have noticed that," he said. "You were managing a solicitor and a body of evidence," Cecily said. "It was not the moment." "I noticed it," he said, "and I did not act." "There is a difference." She looked at him. He was watching her in a way that had nothing to do with the will or the estate or the problem they had just resolved, and her pulse did the same irregular thing it had done at the King's Arms, and she was rather tired of managing it. "Miss Hartwell?" he said Cecily. He used her name as Lord Ashmore had used it, deliberately, as though naming a thing he had decided to acknowledge rather than overlook. "You will have a position, if you want one, a proper one. You could serve as the estate's manager of correspondence until Harriet is old enough to need a companion. I would not call you only the secretary." She thought about what it would mean to stay. She thought about the small room above the servants' stair, the copy of the will in the locked case, the 3 years she had spent keeping careful record of a house that had not thought to keep careful record of her. She thought about the underfootman's face when Lord Dunmore had simply spoken her name in the corridor, and the nephew had stepped aside. "What would you call me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He moved from the hearth to the table, and he put both hands flat on it in the way she had seen him do before. Not the pressing down manner of a man holding something still to hold it still, but the way a man does it when he needs the table's solidity under his hands, while he decides how much of the truth to say. "I would call you indispensable," he said, "and then in time I hope something else entirely." The room held the quality of a breath not yet released. Cecily looked at his hands on the table. She looked at the fire. She looked at the east window and the clean November sky beyond it. "Then I will stay," she said. He did not smile. Precisely. He had, she was beginning to understand, a way of not smiling that was more expressive than a smile. Something shifted in the lines around his eyes, and he drew a slow breath. And he lifted one hand from the table and turned it palm upward, in a gesture she recognized as the nearest a careful man comes to opening a door. She crossed the room to him. She put her hand in his. His hand closed around it with a steadiness that had nothing tentative in it. They stood at the table in the library at Dunvale, and the fire burned low, and outside the November sky went on being clean and cold and very wide. There is a thing Cecily would have told you if you had asked her later about the months that followed. She would have told you that the work of correcting a forgery is less complicated than the work of learning that a person who has looked through you for 3 years of their own grief was the entire time in the slow process of learning to see. He had left for the continent 14 months after his wife's death, a death he attributed in the small hours of sleeplessness to a particular decision he had made and then unmade too late. He carried the decision like a stone in his coat pocket. He had not told anyone about the stone. It was not his practice to tell people things. He told Cecily in December, standing at the east window in the library that was becoming their room by a logic neither of them had named aloud, watching the first snow settle on the drive. He told her the way a man tells a thing he has held alone until holding it is no longer bearable. She listened, and she did not say that it was not his fault, because he had not asked her to say that, and she thought the kindest thing available to her was not a verdict, but a witness. She said, "I am glad you told me." He turned from the window, and she saw his face in the way she had not permitted herself to study it before, the tired lines at the corners of his eyes, the jaw that was always a little too controlled. She reached up and touched his face with one hand with all the deliberateness she had, and he closed his eyes and held very still the way he had gone, still reading the March will as though the thing in front of him required his complete attention. By Christmas, Harriet had arrived at Dunvale with her widowed mother, Mrs. Clara Pembroke, a quiet, sensible woman who assessed the situation at the estate with a rapidity that suggested she had expected something of this kind and was not surprised to find it in progress. Harriet brought her stuffed rabbit and her solemn expression, and appeared at Cecily's desk on the second afternoon to ask what the letters were about, in the same tone she had used at age 7, as though no intervening time had passed. Cecily told her, in terms appropriate to a 9-year-old, about the letters. Harriet listened and asked several pointed questions, and then asked if she might look at the locked case where the copy of the will had been kept. Cecily opened it. It was empty. The will was in Hartley's files now, properly restored and witnessed, and a matter of county record. The case was a small wooden box, unremarkable, lined in faded green baize. Harriet examined it with considerable seriousness. "You kept the important thing in it," Harriet said. "I did," Cecily said. "And now the important thing is somewhere safe," Harriet said. "Yes," Cecily said. Harriet nodded, apparently satisfied, and went out. Cecily closed the case and left it on the desk because it had earned its place there. The nephew did not return to Dunvale. He was not pursued, as matters stood, into criminal proceedings because the evidence that had been assembled was sufficient to void the will without requiring a trial, and Lord Dunmore was not a man given to vengeance when correction would serve. He would find himself without the estate, without the income, without the character of a man. His acquaintances trusted with property. The county's memory was long. It was, in its quiet way, thorough. By the following spring, when the oaks along the drive were in early leaf and the rooms at Dunvale smelled of new fire and old books, he asked her to marry him in the library, standing at the east window on a Tuesday afternoon that was unremarkable in every particular except the one. He said, "I am asking because I want to, not because it resolves anything. I want that to be plain." She said, "That is plain." He said, "Will you?" She said, "Yes." He took both her hands and held them, and she felt the steadiness of him as she had learned to feel it. Not the steadiness of a man pressing down on something to keep it still, but the steadiness of a man who has put down the stone and found that his hands are free. On the desk in the corner, the small wooden case sat where she had left it in November. The baize inside was the green of new oaks, or perhaps it had always been that color, and she had not noticed until the light was right. The windows of Dunvale were full of spring, and the oaks were coming in, and she was exactly where she had put herself by being thorough. It was, she thought, the best possible use of the habit. Thank you for staying with Cecily through every careful step of this. If her story settled something in you, leave a word in the comments below. It means more than you know. Mrs. Peel had been 19 years at Dunvale. She had outlasted 2 housekeepers, a head footman who drank, and a cook who had once thrown a copper pot at a visiting parson and considered herself entirely justified in having done so. She was a woman of considerable memory and considered loyalty, and when Cecily came to her on the evening of the second day, after he had gone back to the King's Arms with the March will in his coat, she told Cecily to sit down at the kitchen table and poured 2 cups of something warming from the pot at the fire, and said, without preamble, "I have been waiting for someone to ask." She confirmed the March signing. She confirmed the date, the room, the light, the order of the signatures, the wax and the seal, and the way Lord Ashmore had said, just before they left him, that it was done, and he was glad it was done. She confirmed that she had never seen a Mr. Sefton nor a Mr. Crabbe at Dunvale in any capacity that predated the week of the Lord's death. "You will be called to speak it formally," Cecily said. Peel wrapped both hands around her cup and said with considerable composure, "I have been called to speak formally before. When the under-footman stole the silver in 1813, and the magistrate came for the household, I spoke. I am not afraid of formal speech." Cecily looked at her across the kitchen table, and she thought about the way the world arranges women of service at a careful distance from any proceeding that affects them directly, and then requires their testimony to resolve it. She thought about the narrow particular courage of continuing to act from one's values inside a world that makes no particular provision for the people who do. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Peel nodded. She said, "Lord Ashmore was a good man. He had his eccentricities, and he was not always easy, but he was a good man, and he thought of Harriet, and he wanted the place kept right. I will not stand by while someone undoes what he wanted." She took a long drink from her cup, and Cecily took a long drink from hers, and the kitchen fire burned steadily, and outside the November night pressed against the windows with all its cold weight. That evening, while the nephew was at the card table and Sefton was with him and Crabbe had gone out, Cecily went to the study. She knew every drawer in that room. She had catalogued the contents twice in 3 years. Once when she first arrived, and Lord Ashmore had said she might as well know where everything was, and once 18 months ago, when he had reorganized the filing system and then become confused about where he had put certain things and relied on Cecily to remember. She went to the East Cabinet. She found the folio labeled Household Accounts for 1818. She opened it, and she looked at the original March will with Lord Ashmore's signature and the attestations of Mrs. Peel and of Miss Hartwell, secretary, written in her own neat hand. Someone had been through the study. The folio had been placed behind a different set of files than she remembered, and one of the brass cabinet handles bore a faint smear she did not think had been there in October. The folio had been misfiled in a way that assumed no one would look in the household accounts of 1818 for a legal document signed in 1820, and he had not counted on a secretary who filed things, and then remembered where she had filed them. He had not, she thought, counted on a secretary at all. He had looked at her and seen a woman in a gray dress who kept correspondence, and he had not looked further. It was the error of the season in the marriage market, and the world's entire apparatus of dismissal. It was the error that undid him. She did not remove the document. She photographed it with her memory, confirmed it was intact, and replaced the folio precisely as she had found it. Hartley would send someone for the original in due course, with proper authority and witnesses, and the chain of custody would be unimpeachable. She had her copy. She had Mrs. Peel. She had Lord Dunmore, who was at this moment in the county seat, doing what she had sent him to do. She closed the cabinet, She went upstairs to her room above the servants' stair. She lit the small candle on the nightstand, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she looked at the dark drive below, the bare oaks just visible against the sky, and she allowed herself, quietly and without drama, to be frightened. She had been carrying the fear since the morning in the unlit hall, and it needed somewhere to go. She let it go into the dark and the cold air and the familiar sight of the drive she had walked every morning for 3 years with Lord Ashmore's correspondence under her arm. Then she put it down. The fear, the way you put down a thing you have been carrying too long, and she blew out the candle. And she went to bed. She did not sleep well. She slept adequately, which was all she required. In the morning, she rose at her customary hour and dressed in the dark green gown and went down to her desk and worked steadily through the estate correspondence, which did not stop accumulating simply because the estate's ownership was in question. Farmers wrote about their tenancy agreements. The chandler wrote about a delivery delayed. The vicar wrote to confirm the date of the late Lord's memorial service. She answered all of them in the voice they required, efficient and measured and giving away nothing, because what was happening at Dunvale was not yet a matter of public knowledge, and it was not her place to make it one. He passed through the corridor outside the study twice. The second time he paused, and she was aware of his pause without looking up from the letter she was writing, and then he went on. She sealed the vicar's letter. She set it with the others to go out with the afternoon post. She pulled the next letter from the pile and began to read it. She was Lord Ashmore's secretary. She worked until the work was done. He returned in the late afternoon of the third day with Hartley beside him, and the light was going by the time they reached Dunvale, the sky streaked in the particular colors of a November evening, gray and amber, and the cold blue of approaching dark. Cecily met them in the hall. He looked at her face, and she looked at his. And they did not need to speak about what had been accomplished or what remained, because the information was apparent in the way each of them was standing. Hartley said pleasantly, "A considerable body of evidence, Miss Hartwell. I compliment Lord Ashmore on the quality of his secretary." "I compliment Lord Ashmore on his secretary myself," Lord Dunmore said, looking at Cecily with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She looked at him steadily. She felt her pulse do the thing. She said, "Mr. Dinmatius." "Hartley, may I offer you tea before tomorrow's proceedings?" Hartley said yes with evident relief, and the three of them went to the library, and Mrs. Peel brought tea without being asked. Because Mrs. Peel had 19 years of experience at Dunvale and understood when tea was required. They were, all of them, people who understood what the work required, and who did it, and who knew that the doing was its own particular form of worth. The day Hartley presented the evidence to Mr. Prentice, Cecily sat in the hall outside the library, for most of the morning because no one had thought to include her in the room, and she had not pressed herself in. Peel brought her a cup of tea at 10:30 and set it on the bench beside her and did not say anything because 19 years of service had given the housekeeper a precise understanding of when words were wanted, and when the best thing available was warm tea and company. Cecily drank the tea. She listened to the low voices on the other side of the library door, the particular cadence of legal speech, the long pauses, the occasional brief interjection from the executor, the longer pauses that followed. She thought about Harriet with her stuffed rabbit and her solemn questions. She thought about Lord Ashmore pressing his seal into the wax of his own will with both hands and saying, "There, that is done." Then, she thought about the looping capital A that no other hand could reproduce, and the way the October document had rendered it flat and without flourish, correct in its general form, but wrong in the specific way that only someone who knew the original intimately could detect. It was done. She did not yet know it was done, but she knew, in the way a person knows a thing before the knowing is confirmed, that the work had held. When the library door opened at last and Hartley came out with Prentice behind him, she rose from the bench. Hartley looked at her with the evaluating expression she had come to associate with men who reassess their assumptions about a person mid-conversation. Prentice looked past her, briefly, in the manner of a man looking for somewhere comfortable to direct his gaze, and found nothing convenient. "The matter will proceed to a formal application for restoration," Hartley said to Cecily, as though she were a party to the proceedings in her own right. Lord Dunmore will petition the appropriate court. Given the weight of the evidence, we expect no difficulty. Lord Dunmore. She had not yet adjusted to hearing him called that. It was the title that came with the executorship, and eventually, if Harriet had no male heirs, and the entail ran its course, with rather more than the executorship, she did not think about the eventually. She thought about the present fact of it, which was that he had the standing, and had used it, and had arrived at the end of the library morning without having failed the task she had brought to him. Lord Dunmore came out last. He looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, the one that lived in the lines around his eyes. He said, "Come inside. There is more to discuss." She went inside. He held the door. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. She was aware, as she crossed the threshold with his hand still on the door behind her, of the particular weight of small things at the end of long efforts, the way the body registers courtesy as something more than courtesy when it has been a long time without it. She did not say anything. She sat in the chair Hartley indicated, which was at the table this time, which was where she should have been sitting all morning, and she listened to the remainder of the proceedings with her hands folded in her lap and her pulse at its usual rate, more or less. Prentice departed an hour later with a set of documents to file and a considerably diminished air about him. Hartley stayed to take a formal statement from Mrs. Trow. Peel, who gave it in the kitchen with the fire going, and her hands folded in her apron, and her account so precise and so consistent with the physical evidence already assembled that Hartley wrote, in the margin of his own notes, the word reliable, underlined once. The estate would hold, the true will would be restored. Harriet would come to Dunvale and find it waiting for her, and she would stay. She had not in 3 years at Dunvale thought about what staying would mean. She had thought about what leaving would mean, because leaving was always the operative question for a woman in service. The position ended, the family moved, the Lord died. The character reference carried you forward, or it did not. She had been, in all 3 years, in transit, in the particular suspension of a person whose life is borrowed time, borrowed rooms, borrowed purpose. She thought about staying now. She thought about what it would feel like to wake in the morning without counting the days remaining. She looked at the east window in the library where the clean winter light came in at its particular angle, and she thought about him saying, "I would call you indispensable," and then in time, I hope, something else entirely. She had not said anything at the time beyond, "Then I will stay," she thought. Sitting in the library after Hartley had gone, and before she went to find Mrs. Peel to tell her that her account had been received and the case was progressing, that she would have to learn what it meant to plan for a future that did not end in 3 weeks. She had the skills for it. She was thorough. She rose from the table. She crossed to the east window and looked at the drive and the bare oaks and the gray November sky. Behind her, she heard him come back into the library from wherever he had been, and she heard him stop when he saw her at the window. He did not speak immediately. She had noticed this about him, that he did not fill the silence when the silence was not empty, that he understood the difference between a silence that needed something and a silence that was already holding what it needed. "Hartley is pleased," he said after a moment. "Hartley should be pleased," Cecily said. The evidence was very clear. "The evidence," he said, "was made very clear by someone who thought to copy a document in March and keep it in a locked case for 9 months. She turned from the window. He was at the hearth in much the same position as he had stood when she had first seen him at the King's Arms. The broad shoulders, the too long dark hair, the pewter eyes that went very still when they were paying close attention. He was paying close attention now. "I did not know in March that I would need it in November," she said. "No," he said, "but you kept it anyway." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire was very quiet. "That is what thoroughness is," Cecily said. "You keep the thing that might matter, even when you do not yet know if it will matter. You do the work before the reason for the work has announced itself." He moved from the hearth. He came to stand near her at the window, not beside her precisely, but near enough that she was aware of the warmth of him at this distance, and aware that he had crossed the room with deliberate intention. "I have not been thorough," he said. "I have been," and he paused, in the way he paused before things that cost him something. "Attentive to the wrong difficulty for a long time. I attended to what I had lost. I did not attend to what was in front of me." Outside, the first flake of what would become the season's first snow appeared against the dark oaks, and then another, and the drive began to go white at its edges, slowly and without announcement, the way the most significant changes arrive. Cecily watched the snow. She said, "You are attending now." "Yes," he said, "I am." The snow continued. The library fire burned steadily. The locked case sat empty on the corner of the desk. Its purpose accomplished, the green baize inside the color of spring in a November room, waiting for whatever it would be asked to hold next.